Hello, hi. Welcome back. I'm Daniel Kirsch. This is the second lecture video in Module 4 about elucidating social science concepts and language work is the overarching name. And instead of talking to you too much instructionally and talking to you about what these concepts mean, I think you get that in a couple of other places really directly from the author we're talking about, Fred Schaffer. And I want to talk to you today about the way that I, got acquainted with him as a teacher. So first of all, to begin, what's ECPR? ECPR was and is the European Consortium for Political Research, and they do something in the summer and in the winter called a method school. And so the way that I found out about it is two ways. One is that I knew that there is kind of a method school, a qualitative method school especially, that's hosted in the US that a couple of my friends have attended, that Fred Schaffer and other interpretive methodologists have taught at. And these workshops, my friends have said have been terrific and really, to use an ethnographic term, really immersive. They're intense. They're over the summer or the winter, and I think the American ones are exclusively in the summer. But they're a week or two, and you take basically several courses, all kind of, intensified in the course of like 2 weeks, and they last 3 days a piece. And that was an experience that I really thought would be valuable, especially learning a lot more about interpretive methodology in the last couple of years. And so I started to look up earlier in 2021 the idea that I looked up some syllabi from actually Dvoriano and Peregrine Schwartz-Shea. But I also remembered that and I came across one that they did in a method school in Europe, and I remember that they had talked about that and that's where they did the interview for their podcast that I know many of you listened to in Module 1. So they were doing this kind of remote podcast interview, and they were at the method school in Europe in 2019, 2018 maybe. And I was like, oh, that sounds interesting. If both of them are involved in that, I wonder if they're still involved in that. So I looked up them, and I looked up, some of the other names I knew and authors I liked. And it turned out that, Fred Schaffer was there, and there was also another one that was kind of more overarching interpretive methods course. And I thought about taking that, but one consideration, let me skip to this one first, is the time difference. Now, the method schools historically had been taught just in Europe, like you go there. And, that's probably why Dvoriano, she lived, I don't know her whole life story, but she used to be a professor at Cal State East Bay, just sort of down the road from us. But she's now a kind of a guest professor permanently at the University of Amsterdam, or Amsterdam University, not sure. Anyway, the two of them have taught in Europe, and they would go to these locations, wherever, Prague and the Netherlands and everywhere else in Western Europe mostly. And it seemed like a really neat thing to do, but seemed pretty expensive to do something like that. So it was one of the few times that I've said, oh well, thankfully there's a reason that it can't be in person, and so maybe I could take advantage of that. And so there was a virtual method school in 2020 and for the summer, and they have a winter one as well. So I thought, why don't I try to go to the summer one here and see if I can go. I don't think there's a prohibition on Americans attending. Let me see what it costs and when it is and what courses are being offered. So I started looking up all that stuff, and one of the courses that was being offered, like I said, the interpretive methodology one that might have been just good to go to, it's more public policy oriented, was at I looked up the time difference, being she was teaching from Denmark, and it would have been from 12:30 a.m. to 3 a.m. For 5 days in early August. So I said, no, I'd really rather not do that. And I looked up Fred Schaffer's course, Working with Concepts, and he'd be teaching it. I looked up the times. It was 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. So I said, oh, that's only 6 a.m. for me. And for people in Europe, it was something like 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And I think someone in Russia, she might have been a little bit later than that, maybe 5 o'clock or something. So I thought this is maybe something I should pursue, and so in that regard, the getting up early was challenging. I would wake up at 5:30 to go to class at 6 o'clock, and we'd have this really intense 2-hour seminar. And I won't. I'm already boring you, I know, but I'm not going to bore you with what the content was day to day. But ask me one-on-one if you want. Come to my office hours, and I'll tell you. But we basically went through. We spent a lot of time on positivism, actually. And even though obviously Schaffer is not a positivist, he kind of says you need to be bilingual in between the two schools of thought. And so you sort of have to know what positivism is in order to understand why interpretivism is so different from it, and so kind of opposed to it. So we did that over the course of 5 days, 2 hours each morning from Monday to Friday, and there was no, for those of us who are used to, I think, even though he is American, right, and Schaffer, and maybe it wasn't a reflection of him, but more the ethic of the school, it's just that there wasn't a lot of getting to know you time, and there wasn't a whole lot of, let's all wrap up and give each other high fives kind of time. It was more like, okay, let's just jump in on Monday. I hope you all read what I asked you to. I have some, I hope you watched my lecture videos, and here's how we're going to do the course. Any questions? Okay. Let me talk to you about, what the work you'll be doing today. And then and then at the end, I thought I'd have a chance to sort of ask people questions or get to know a few people, but, we got to know people just through the work, not really through conversation. And so that was strange to me. But there were 11 other people besides me in the class, and so I could see everyone all the time in the Zoom class. Everybody turned their cameras on, by the way, which was, to me, very refreshing. And helpful, because I'm looking at people and not just a black screen at 6 a.m. And I was really impressed by the level of detail of all of these assignments that he gave us, and that's why I'm kind of passing on one of them to you. Is just the one, not any of the positivism stuff, like really the kind of the main focus of his research and the research that I'm doing in that vein is what I'm showing you. So anyway, so that was kind of the content of what we did. And one of the more interesting things that we did is, and by the way, he did say another 4 hours each day of work in addition to the 2 hours of work. And let me tell you, when you have a 2-year-old and your spouse works and you're trying to put together, a course, as well as just keep up with daily household and parenting maintenance, squeezing in an extra 6 hours was not a fun experience. And I had a lot more sympathy for students, frankly, after that, because I didn't have any of those responsibilities when I was a student. And so, anybody who goes back to school after they kind of have their own home and they have their own life, is really, and have other priorities besides school, frankly, is to me much more impressive now than it was before this summer. But anyway, so one of the things that to me was really interesting that we did, and I think is often what Fred Schaffer is known for in these method schools, is he likes to have you go out into a public place and ask people, see if anybody will agree to be interviewed as like a grad student, and maybe, I'm not sure, you might be wearing a button or something, or you're just kind of standing in a mall. There's a mall in Syracuse, because one of the method schools is at Syracuse University, and he just has people sort of stand in the mall and say, "Oh, can you come here a minute? I want to talk to you about political science." And people agree, and maybe they give incentives. I don't know, but I've had a couple friends do this, and they have to say, what here's a concept. Try to see what you can get people to tell you about how they understand that concept. And oftentimes, I think bureaucratic autonomy was what my one friend had said he wanted to interview people about, and most people just gave him blank stares. They had no idea what he was talking about. But Schaffer is trying to demonstrate experience near and experience distant concepts, and also what the kind of ordinary language usage of concepts are, not just what the kind of academic usage of it is. So obviously you couldn't do that, because we were all in different locations, we were all in different countries, and we were in the middle of a pandemic. So we had to, he said, just go out and interview anybody you want. Over Zoom maybe, or in your house, doesn't matter. He showed us a video of him interviewing his daughter, which was very cool. And actually it wasn't him interviewing his daughter, it wasn't that. She was playing a part in an interview transcript that he had done in the Philippines. So she wasn't being interviewed, but she was the actor who was being interviewed in that sense. He was just showing what an ordinary language interview was, and I'll get more to what ordinary language interviewing is maybe in the next video. But I had to go and talk to someone, so I decided to interview my father, my dad, who's on the East Coast, and is not an academic, and is not really. He's not somebody who I usually talk about politics with. But he was very nice to give up some time for this, and we had about a half-hour interview where I had to ask him some very kind of direct questions about the concept that I was working on. And what's interesting is that Schaffer said to me that it was a really cool interview, because you could see just in his, I said two things about my father in the kind of little biography I had to write of who this person was I was interviewing, that he was, his background was partially in construction and real estate, and also in sports and business. So those are kind of his touchstones. And so where his mind went immediately when I used this one concept of the base, and I said, just tell me what you think of the base. He was, he talked about baseball, he talked about baseboards, just immediately, and it was really amazing to see how much context can define, the way we talk about a concept. And so, I decided to ask him something you're not supposed to do, and kind of ask a leading question. I said, what about politics? Can you use the base in politics? And, he said right away something about, well, there's people who you have a base, and you try to get your base to get you elected, or you just need a few more people beyond your base and you can get elected. And so kind of taking that for granted. So so that was really neat to interview him, and he was he was really very nice to participate, and I think I have yet to debrief with him about it, but it was about 2 months ago. So I'm going to be asking you all to interview someone in the next module, not in this one. And maybe that's something you could think about, is who you would go out and interview. But I just had to make a call that day. I said, okay. I texted him and said, can you talk today? And so we talked and sort of half hour and told him kind of what it was, and it was fine. So talk to somebody you know, talk to somebody you don't know. But we'll talk about that more later. But the whole point is to see how concepts are actually used. So instead of you imposing a definition as a social scientist, you're instead trying to elucidate. You're trying to ground that concept in reality. How do people actually use that in a day-to-day basis, and how does the usage, the way it's actually used and the way it's kind of day-to-day defined by real regular people, how does that influence behavior? How does it influence political behavior? How does it influence political actions? And I think that's really where you start to see the power of whether concepts can be really defined from an observer perspective, or if the observer has to more understand what those concepts are to the people on the ground. So in that way, it was valuable to do that work. And I want to say something I haven't mentioned, which is all the people that I encountered, all the people in my cohort in the Working with Concepts class were amazingly professional. And these very sophisticated political scientists from all over Europe. And I have them all in a notebook that I wrote down, but I didn't bother to kind of use it for this lecture video. But we at various points we had to kind of get paired up for group work and things like that. But the kind of depth of understanding that they brought to it was incredible. And one thing that I'm asking you to do is, if you don't want to use the essay question about the literature review, let me just read to you this question that I wrote as an alternative essay that you can do instead of the literature review. And think of it as an exercise in reflexivity that I'm kind of doing right now. What is the most intense seminar learning experience that you've ever had? Have you ever been in a class or any cohort of any kind where you all were together for a short time with a teacher or leader, and all were struggling toward the same goal or toward the same individual goals? What did it teach you about either the material you were learning or the process itself, which ended up being, the learning or the process, which ended up being more important to you in the long run? So I think that would be an interesting exercise in reflexivity, and these are not for discussion necessarily, but they can be if you want. If you want to share something like this, and maybe I'll ask people to share what they wrote about in one of the in one of the sessions we have, either in the full class or just in groups. So that might be something you could talk about in class on Thursday if you watched this before then. So all these people, some of the countries people came from: Kazakhstan, Albania, the Czech Republic, Norway, Spain, Russia, Germany, India. So that's not Europe, but everywhere else is arguably Europe. And there were 2 people from the same department in Norway. I guess that's something you could have predicted. Not the Norway thing, but that 2 people would have one person would have brought the other in. But mostly everybody had very diverse backgrounds, and some were graduate students, some were faculty, and all of them were very open-minded about this. Not all of them were ready to kind of jump in with both feet to kind of quote unquote be an interpretivist, but they at least were really enthusiastic about going through Fred Schaffer's framework of class in a very open-minded way, and they brought in their knowledge, but they all had a lot of humility. So I just found it to be one of the best learning experiences of my career. Maybe I would rank it up there as, if I had to group it together with grad school, it's probably one of my top 5 classes I ever took, and college as well. Like I remember just about every course I ever took, and I would have to say it's in the top 5 courses I've ever taken. So I'm really glad I did it, even though it was really difficult. So the other things I have written down in this lecture video, I'll just kind of burn through a little quickly. I mentioned Wittgenstein in the first video. Again, he's just someone who kind of created the concept of ordinary language, and how language is a game. It's a game that we engage in different contexts, is really what Wittgenstein talked a lot about, and what Schaffer kind of derives a lot of Wittgenstein's analysis into. He kind of talks about how Wittgenstein was brilliant and had and discusses language as games, and discusses there are different rules to different games in different contexts, and it's within these different games, these different contexts, that we have to understand how language is used, and we have to be very careful about acknowledging the rules of those different games when we're discussing how concepts are either utilized, or how they motivate different political actions or social actions. So Wittgenstein is kind of the source of a lot of his inspiration, if you will. So is Foucault, Michel Foucault, and a lot of what I'm asking you to do in the worksheet is and I'm asking you to do it, meaning I'm asking you to do this work of Schaffer's. This was the worksheet he had several worksheets, one worksheet a day basically. But this worksheet is in genealogical, what does genealogical mean? Genealogical elucidation of concepts. And it's tracing the history of a concept. That's basically what it is. And tracing the history of a concept sounds a lot easier than it is. You really have to dig very deep, but there are some great tools out there now in technology to be able to find, in a relatively quick way, kind of be detectives and find out through your own research, when did a concept take on its current meaning, and when did it even originate as a concept. So Foucault, is one of the readings for this course was Foucault, and I'm not sure that I even downloaded as much of the work as I should have, but Foucault was one of the more interesting kind of readings that he exposed us to, but it's pretty difficult. He said make sure you have a really strong cup of coffee when you sit down with Foucault, and devote a lot of extra time to be able to do it. But at any rate, Foucault's concept of genealogy and genealogical research is supposed to go a long way towards exposing, how power has figured into the creation of a concept. And tools like Google Scholar, Google Ngram Viewer, and the Oxford English Dictionary, and a number of other university library resources are excellent in this regard, and I'm happy to walk you through them if you like when we're in class or independently. But the worksheet that I gave you is the worksheet that I did this summer, and that Fred Schaffer, it obviously says copyright Fred Schaffer, so it's his work. So he put together this whole worksheet, and it's very difficult. And Giovanni Sartori is someone he talks about who he really admires, and I actually admire too. And I've known about his work since I was in college, and he was definitely a positivist social scientist, and he's someone who really tried to be like David Collier toward this very noble goal of trying to foster understanding and kind of create as wide of a net as possible over concepts but one of the concepts he did was family, which, Schaffer talks about as being actually quite exclusionary of many different kinds of families. And anyway, so I'm going to skip over this, well. And finally, Schaffer talks about the concept of democracy and also of motherhood. And I believe he talks about motherhood, or at least womanhood, within the book. And I'll let him talk about that with you. But the upshot is that, just in trying to create any definition that you think applies to all cases, you are going to miss so many important cases, and by definition you're going to be distorting the real meaning, and certainly the evolving meaning of words and concepts like that. And the very last thing I have written down to talk about in this regard is Fred Schaffer's existing and historical research, which I think is a good example of all the stuff he's trying to do. One of the things he's done a lot of research into is the concept of democracy, and one book that got a lot of praise and a lot of attention is called Democracy in Translation. And democracia is the concept directly translated into Senegalese, and he spent this time in Senegal, that apparently was a French colony, and in Senegal they have this concept of democracia that does not directly translate as democracy in all cases, or is not what we would recognize anyway in the West as democracy. So so he ends up talking to a lot of people about it, I believe in French himself, but also with some research assistants, and he kind of defines a population and talks to them. And he did the same thing in the Philippines, only in the Philippines he had to rely a lot more heavily on research assistants because no one spoke English. They spoke the local language. And so he did a lot of research on democracy and the way people understood democracy in the Philippines. And now he's moving on to the concept of voting, which apparently he says has been the we've only had the modern concept of voting really since Scotland, voting in church elections in like the 16th century, something like that. So he's kind of doing a kind of a massive genealogy of the word voting and the concept of voting since that time in the English language. So sounds interesting to me. So that's about all for this YouTube lecture. I will see you in the next one.